Okay, welcome everybody. I'm really delighted to be chairing this session on housing legislation updates with you. My name is Beth Watts-Cobbe. I'm an academic at iSphere, a research institute within Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh that specialises in homelessness, housing and poverty research. Working in these areas, and I'm sure you'll identify with this, it's often a challenge to stay positive, and that is certainly the case at the moment for reasons touched on in that last opening session. Local authorities and third sector organisations are facing acute challenges supporting those facing homelessness in the context of a cost of living crisis, a weakened welfare safety net, an often poorly functioning housing system and other pressures. But the focus of this session today does give me a chance to at least begin on a positive note. The devolution of housing and homelessness related powers to the UK's constituent nations over the last 2 decades has led to really positive changes in the policy and legal context. We've seen what I think of as sort of policy leapfrog and mutual learning across England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And that policy experimentation, further catalysed in some ways by the pandemic, leaves us in a far better legal position in relation to homelessness than we were prior to devolution. Homelessness practice across the UK has become increasingly preventative, and in Wales and Scotland, this preventative focus is now enshrined in law, as you all know. In some parts of the UK, we have duties on other public bodies to either refer into homelessness services or cooperate with them to meet people's needs. We've seen changes in the regulation of the private rented sector that increasingly protect tenants, and changes continue. This session is an opportunity to update you all on recent and upcoming changes and talk about what remains to be done in terms of further improving these legal frameworks and in ensuring that they're effectively implemented. So before I introduce our panel today, we would like to know a bit more about who's in this virtual room with us. So I have 2 requests of you, our attendees. First of all, can you fill in the poll that our silent partner Lau is going to run for you now, telling us where in the UK you are joining us from, or you work, or if indeed it's outside the UK. If you're pan-UK, I guess maybe click other. There we go, perfect. Oh, it's asking me to complete it too. There we go. So, second, can I invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat, which I'm seeing some people are already doing. Thank you for that. We would love to know your name, your organisation and role. And just to help us get to know you a little bit more and start the conversation, I would like to know the bit of legislation that you think most helps or hinders you in your frontline role, assisting people facing homelessness. Or if you're not in a frontline role, the specific bit of the law that you think most helps or hinders effective responses to homelessness generally. So it would be great if you could spend a moment doing that. I'm going to pause for a minute to let you have a think about that. Thanks for all those introductions. No one's taking the plunge in calling out a bit of homelessness or wider law. Feel free at any point, maybe you'll get braver as we go along. It would be lovely to hear from you. Let me introduce our panel. So we have Rhiannon Sims, Senior Policy Officer at Crisis Scotland on the call. We have Jennie Bibbings, Head of Campaigns at Shelter Cymru. And we have Stephen Morrison, Policy Coordinator at Housing Rights Northern Ireland. And the discussion we're going to have will let us zero in on the really interesting developments in these countries. There have, of course, been really important developments in England, the passing of the Homelessness Reduction Act, which introduced priority need and intentionality blind prevention and relief duties on local authorities, and the recently published Renters Reform Bill, which seeks to end no-fault evictions alongside other protections for tenants. This is something we can talk about in the discussion, and our speakers from Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland may also be able to speak about the English case from their vantage points. We'd love to hear from you too. We're going to start with a 5-minute introduction from each of our panellists. After that, I have some questions myself to guide the discussion that will follow, but we'd really like this to be an interactive session with you. So please do share your reflections in the chat, and in particular, ask questions in the Q&A tab. You can also vote up questions others have asked that you particularly like. So on that note, Rhiannon, if you go ahead and share your slides and begin your context setting intro.
Keep me right, Beth. Can you see the slides there?
Perfectly.
Is that okay? Great. Okay, so this is going to be very much a whistle-stop tour of changes in legislation in Scotland. What I'm going to cover is eligibility for assistance for support with homelessness, changes in standards in temporary accommodation, various reforms to the private rented sector, and then last but not least, I'll touch on prevention. So just to begin with, I think it's worth recognising that the strengths in our approach to responding to homelessness in Scotland. There's much wider entitlement to assistance here than elsewhere, and partly that's to do with the tests for eligibility. So firstly, the test for priority assistance was phased out and then abolished in 2012. Local authorities can now choose whether to apply the intentionality test as of November 2019, which basically gives them discretion to investigate intentionality rather than a duty to apply that test. And much more recently, the test for local connection was suspended as of autumn last year, and that suspends the ability of local authorities to refer people to another authority where they might have an established local connection. But these changes in eligibility have also come alongside changes in relation to the standards in temporary accommodation, trying to increase and improve standards in temporary accommodation. So probably the most important thing to note on that topic is the changes to the unsuitable accommodation order. So originally that came into force in 2014, restricting the use of hotels and bed and breakfast accommodation for pregnant women or families with children to a maximum of 14 days. And then that was then changed to a week in 2017. But following a recommendation from the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group, that order was then extended to all household types well, the commitment was made to do that in May 2021, but the implementation of it was somewhat bumpy due to it being complicated by the pandemic. So there were exemptions applied, but all of those exemptions were done away with by October last year. So now all those exemptions have been removed, and local authorities now must comply with that new unsuitable accommodation order, which applies to all households. The other thing worth mentioning is a bit of work developing standards that would be applied to all types of temporary accommodation. The hope is that those would be made legally enforceable, but it will be a couple of years before, at least a couple of years before that would come into force, but it's one to watch. So the other area that has seen huge changes is in relation to private rented tenancies. So first of all, I think it's worth noting that we already have sort of stronger protections than elsewhere in the UK through the Private Housing Tenancies Act 2016. And that kind of offers more security through an open-ended tenancy, and also means rents can't be increased more than once a year. And we also have things like the landlord register and third-party tenancy deposit schemes. But the most recent changes are in relation to basically making permanent some of the temporary measures that were introduced during the pandemic. So those include things like introducing pre-action protocols on PRS landlords, and also making all eviction grounds discretionary rather than mandatory. And more recently, again, in response to the cost of living crisis, emergency legislation was introduced last year, which paused the enforcement of evictions, and this was extended to for another 6 months to September this year. And it also introduced a cap on rent increases for existing tenancies. So that initially was at 0%, it's now changed to 3%. But importantly, that cap doesn't apply to new tenancies, it's only existing tenancies. Originally, that also applied to social rented tenancies, but following a voluntary agreement with social landlords that they'd implement below inflation rent increases, that was then removed for social landlords. So it only applies to the private rented sector. And just to mention that there's probably more reform coming to the PRS through the proposed changes through an upcoming housing bill, which might introduce things like a national system of rent controls, damages for unlawful evictions, and things like rights for tenants to keep pets and decorate properties and that kind of thing. So last but not least, I wanted to touch on prevention. As Beth mentioned in the introduction, there's been some leapfrogging of policy development in the UK. So in Wales, the law was changed in 2014 to make prevention, really put prevention at the heart of the statutory homelessness framework. And following that, England later adopted a similar approach through the Homelessness Reduction Act. So recognising the need for kind of Scotland to keep pace with that change, the Scottish Government asked Crisis to convene an independent group in order to develop legislative proposals around the prevention of homelessness. So that group was the Prevention Review Group. It was chaired by a colleague of Beth's, Professor Suzanne Fitzpatrick, and it produced its final recommendations in February 2021, which some of those recommendations are on this slide. It includes things like a new prevention duty to provide assistance earlier, where someone might be threatened with homelessness up to 6 months away from potentially losing their home. Stronger partnership working between agencies with a focus on specific at-risk groups, a more person-centred approach through personal housing plans, and really putting the housing options framework onto a statutory basis through a kind of menu of reasonable steps that would be available in every area. Yes, this has been committed to by the Scottish Government to introduce these through the upcoming housing bill, which we're expecting as soon as possible after summer recess. So just to summarise, really, despite Scotland having a really strong statutory safety net with that strong eligibility for assistance, we still see quite a high proportion of people going through the homelessness system. Some research would suggest that's as much as 8% of the population. So it suggests that much more can be done to kind of intervene earlier and prevent housing emergencies before they arise, which has kind of given rise to this strong sort of renewed focus on prevention and what we can do in that area. So I'll leave it at that. I think that was more than 5 minutes, Beth, I'm sorry, but there was a lot to cover.
Thank you, Rhiannon. You know, I didn't clock watch, but I don't think it was much more than 5 minutes, so very well done. Thank you. Jennie, do you want to come in now?
Sure. Yes, this is going to be a really interesting session, isn't it? Because there's so much change in terms of homelessness legislation and so much learning that we can all do from each other. I think from the Welsh perspective, it's probably an understatement to say it's testing times, as you've already been hearing this morning. And I think in Wales, what feels particularly strange is that on the one hand, we've got a very ambitious government agenda. So the Welsh Government has made commitments to end priority need, end intentional homelessness, and follow Scotland in implementing a rapid rehousing transformation programme. But there is this enormous gap between that vision, if you like, and what's actually happening on the ground with homelessness services struggling with huge demand and a lack of access to homes, all of which I'm sure you're well aware of already. An illustration of this is in October just gone, the Welsh Government created a new priority need category for street homelessness, which was a bit of a landmark, if if you like. This was intended to be an interim measure, something that would strengthen the rights of people who were in temporary accommodation as a result of the pandemic, and as a way of cementing the all of that progress from the Everybody In movement during the pandemic, and doing this as an interim measure until priority need gets ended. So yeah, in Wales, we've got a new priority need category for street homelessness. However, we've still got lots of street homelessness. If you go through any of our towns and cities, you will see. And we also have a lot of local authorities now having waiting lists of homeless people who are waiting to get into their temporary accommodation. And these are unlawful waiting lists. And we know local authorities are deeply uncomfortable about this as well. But, you know, hundreds and hundreds of people across Wales who've got a legal entitlement to temporary accommodation and are waiting to get that entitlement realised in practice. Now, we as a housing advice agency, Shelter Cymru, we can help people with judicial review and help individuals to enforce their right, but we've still got this underlying issue of people not being moved on quickly enough from the temporary accommodation, and so that the system becoming jammed up. One positive thing that I really want to share is around social landlords in Wales and how they've responded to the homelessness prevention agenda. They have really stepped up to the plate in recent years. We've had a big culture change in Wales, and in terms of the allocation side of things and moving people from temporary accommodation, a lot of social landlords are now doing 100% nominations agreements and you know, are delivering the goods in terms of allocations. But despite that, we've still got lots of people stuck in temporary accommodation for multiple years, sometimes lots of children in bed and breakfasts, which the law states is not suitable accommodation, lots of issues around unsuitable temporary accommodation as well, despite the suitability of accommodation order that we've got in place. On the evictions front, I've already mentioned about social landlords and the homelessness prevention culture change we've seen. This has really crystallised around a movement that we've had in Wales over the last 4 years to end evictions into homelessness from social housing. So this predates the pandemic. And in that 4 years, since 2019, I think was the start of it, we've had a 72% decrease in possession actions from Welsh social landlords. Obviously, it went down to 0 during the pandemic, but when the courts opened again, the increase has been a lot more moderate than increases in other UK nations. So there's lots of learning there, I think, and particularly for England with the new regulator and the new move to look in a conscious way at social housing culture and homelessness prevention across the piece. I think there's lots to be learned from what's happened in Wales. And if you were interested in learning more, there's a couple of reports on the Shelter Cymru website, which are really useful. There's one called Working Together to End Homelessness from Social Housing. That's a 2019 report. And there was another one which we published last week called Reframing Antisocial Behaviour. So both of those reports have got lots of good practice examples in there, lots of learning. So I would definitely recommend you have a look at those. So yeah, social landlords playing a very, very small role in the generation of homelessness, but that stands in massive contrast with the private rented sector, particularly over the last year. It's kind of hard to think of an appropriate way. This isn't quite the right word, but we've had record-breaking numbers of no-fault evictions in Wales over the last year. Our courts have never seen the volume of no-fault evictions in history than they have over the last year, by quite some margin as well. And I know that this has been an issue across the whole of the UK. In Wales, we've had an added complication, which is the Renting Homes Wales Act came into force in December, and then elements of it came into force in June just gone as well. And this is, if you haven't heard of it already, it's a big piece of legislation, and it basically brings all of tenancy law covering social and private rented housing all into one place. It doesn't massively change the balance of rights and responsibilities, apart from in a couple of areas. For example, we've still got no fault eviction, despite Shelter Cymru's best campaigning efforts, but we do have a 6-month notice period for a no fault eviction now, and that's come in quite recently, and we're hoping that we will see an impact in terms of homelessness, but it is early to say. However, this act, it's been horrible timing because all of the other changes that have been coming in, the interest rate rises, the house price bubble, all of this stuff which has got private landlords wanting to sell, this act has kind of borne the brunt of the blame, and a lot of landlords are just blaming the Welsh government now and saying this is too complicated, it's a huge piece of legislation, I'm not going to bother read it, I'm off, I'm going to sell. So that's been a big issue for us in Wales over the last year. I thought I should quickly mention our landlord licensing scheme, Rent Smart Wales, because I know that other nations are looking at landlord licensing. I mean, that we can talk about this more if we have time, but I think it's been in place for nearly 10 years now. And I guess our reflection is that having a mandatory landlord licensing scheme with mandatory training and so on, it's great in some ways because you know where all your landlords are and you know that they've had at least a basic amount of training. However, it's far from a panacea. We've still got lots of non-compliance, lots of disrepair, lots of illegal evictions, lots of things which landlords should know better than to do. So yeah, there's further development, I think, in terms of making that a really proactive and effective part of our enforcement regulatory framework. One more thing I'm going to mention as well, just to kind of plant a flag. I'm sure we'll come back to it later, but in terms of homelessness prevention and the wider homelessness legislation questions, as Rhiannon already mentioned, we had our statutory prevention duty, which came into force back in 2015. We're now looking at more reform to homelessness legislation in Wales. I mentioned that the minister is going to end priority need and intentionality. If you do that, it's got all sorts of implications for the rest of the homelessness legislative framework. So an expert review panel has been set up. It's also chaired by Suzanne Fitzpatrick. I'm on the panel. We're about to have our final meeting tomorrow, and we're going to be making a whole range of recommendations to the Welsh Government around, and I guess it ties into this leapfrogging theme, increasing prevention to 6 months, for example, possibly ending unreasonable failure to cooperate, a duty to provide support along the lines of what's already in place in Scotland, duties on other public bodies as well. There's loads in there. So just to kind of plant that flag, lots of further change coming up in Welsh homelessness, but obviously it needs to be resourced. And again, I'm sure that's a theme we'll return to.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jenny. That was great. Stephen, let's come to you before moving into the discussion. Do you want to go ahead and share your slides?
Yeah, no problem. Yes, it was just changes to housing legislation in Northern Ireland in 2022, 2023. I'm just going to set the current context and challenges that we're facing before we sort of get into the changes that have come in over the past year. So Northern Ireland has been without a functioning government since April 2022. So therefore, there's been no new policy or legislation introduced from this date. So in terms of the current challenges, our housing need has not been met. Our new build social housing target was cut for 23-24 because of the latest budget. Originally, the target was supposed to be 2,000 new social builds. This has been reduced to 1,475 over the course of next year. We'll have an overwhelming shrink in private rental sector with increasing barriers to access. A lot of this is around the rising of rent costs. So rent in Northern Ireland has risen 9.9% over the past year. Partly this is due to the housing, the interest rates and mortgages. A lot of landlords in Northern Ireland have maybe 1 or 2 properties. There's not so much the concentration of huge portfolios which you might get across the water. So interest rates are really impacting landlords here. A lot of them are now thinking that this is the time to sell, so this is impacting on availability of the private rental sector. Social security support has not risen alongside this. So while rent has been rising over the past few years, in Q2 of 2020, your average rent in Northern Ireland was roughly around £650. Now you're talking £799. People's benefits haven't been raising to keep in line with this. The local housing allowance, for example, has remained static since 2020. So while it was really into that 30th percentile in 2020, then that will have massively dropped just with the scale of the rent rises in Northern Ireland. The Secretary of State has imposed a deeply damaging budget, resulting in cuts across the public sector. I've already touched on one, which is cut to social housing. It's really left the Department of Communities in a really difficult position in terms of how they allocate their budget. They released the stats there, or the final allocations a few days ago. So that included the cut to social housing. Also a cut of 5% to arm's length bodies, which will include the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, which has responsibility for the social sector in Northern Ireland. But there was some positives in terms of mitigation. There was a 5% increase in the fund for supporting people, which in terms of supported living does wonders for people in Northern Ireland, and has shown to be increasingly effective in keeping people out of homelessness. So there's a 5% increase in funding to that. So that was at least one good thing to come out of the budget. In terms of key changes in the past 12 months, the Private Tenancies Act Northern Ireland was introduced in April 2022. It was kind of a truncated scrutinisation process because the executive collapsed in February 22, which started the countdown to an election, which happened in May. So the Assembly was left with a short amount of time through which to put through legislation. So the Private Tenancies Act was already on the floor of the Assembly by then, and was able to be voted through, and it brought in several changes. So there's a tenancy information notice that was introduced, and this basically replaced the rent book. So a tenancy information notice will have information for the tenant and the landlord, including the landlord's address, contact details. It'll also have the monthly rent on it, and would also record payments in terms of your payment for the rent, or if there's any variations to the tenancy, or payments for repairs and things like that. So the notice of variation and the notice regarding past matters kind of feed into that, where they would join the tenancy information notice in terms of keeping in track of everything that's happened over the course of a tenancy. Previously, that wasn't the case. There was a regulation accidentally repealed in 2012, which meant that there was no need for that sort of recording to occur. So that's a massive step forward in terms of protection for tenants. The issuing of receipts was another regulation that was introduced. Now, if a tenant pays money in cash towards their, if it be a rent payment or any other sort of payment relating to their tenancy, the landlord must provide them with a receipt immediately, or they can agree a reasonable time frame for which that will happen. But landlords are now legally bound to issue receipts for any sort of payment in relation to the tenancy to tenants. So again, another massive protection that we previously did not have in Northern Ireland. There's a limit on the tenancy deposit amount. So that limit was introduced, which limits the amount that a deposit can be to the equal of 1 month's rent. That's a positive step forward, but it does come with a caveat in that during the consultation phase, Housing Rights, for example, advised that we should also limit the amount of rent or the amount of rent in advance that could be asked for by a landlord. So what we have seen in the past couple of months, just through our advocacy work, is landlords now demanding a higher amount of rent in advance instead of the previous tenancy, the deposit. Some of these are up to 10 months rent in advance, which is completely unaffordable, and again acts as another massive barrier of access to the private rental sector for people. In fact, some hostels in Northern Ireland are telling us that some of the people staying with them are finding it more difficult to enter private rental accommodation now than they did before the Tenancy Act came in, simply because of that change that allows landlords to ask for a higher amount of rent in advance. There is also exceptions to notice periods. So the notice period here is 4 weeks for a tenant who has been in the tenancy for up to 12 months. Between 12 months and 10 years, it is 8 weeks, and then between 10 years up, it is 12 weeks. So they currently are conducting a consultation on exceptions to that. We similar to Wales, we still have no fault tenancies here. Unfortunately, there's no protections afforded, such as a 6-month notice to quit. You would get your 4-week notice to quit, or 8-week notice to quit, or 12-week notice to quit, depending on the length of your tenancy. But what they are consulting around at the minute is slightly longer notice periods, but exceptions could apply to make those shorter. We would like to see an end to the no fault tenancies in Northern Ireland, and adopt a scheme similar to Scotland in terms of no fault evictions, but where the exceptions would mean that the landlord could then evict the tenant, and that comes with the protections around the first tier tribunal as well. We have no such equivalent in Northern Ireland for private renters, so that's something we'd like to see in the future. And it also is allowed for future regulations, and that's mostly going to be around fire safety, electrical safety, and efficiency standards of houses in the private rental sector as well. Also, what's come in over the previous 12 months is a fundamental review of allocations. So this is a fundamental review by the housing executive of how they allocate social housing. So overall, it was overhauled the selection system for social housing in Northern Ireland, and the following independent research partnered with Northern Ireland Housing Executive and housing associations, and consultation with public stakeholders on recommendations for change. Just in terms of what has already come into regulation, there was 20 recommendations made back in 2013, which went out for consultation in 2017. 18 of the 20 were approved by the Minister for Communities, and they were agreed that they would go forward and be implemented. As of this date, only group 1 of the recommendations has been implemented. So the Housing Executive split them into 4 separate groups with a view to implementing them over time. At the minute, group 1 includes an independent tenure-neutral advice service for Northern Ireland, and the Housing Executive has taken this on themselves. So they now offer independent, tenure-neutral advice for everyone, regardless of their tenure. In Northern Ireland, so in terms of like reducing the risk of homelessness, people now have that access to advice they can go to. Proposal 5 is a greater choice of areas for all applicants for a social home. So this would allow people to select as many areas now as they wish in terms of where they would like to be allocated their social home. Proposal 15 is an applicant may receive 2 reasonable offers of accommodation. This is down from 3, and this is just basically to balance now they can select a greater amount of areas. So that just kind of brings it in line for that. And proposal 16 was social landlords may withdraw an offer of accommodation in specified circumstances. There will be three more groups coming in. Group 2 is due to roll out between February and December of this year, and then group 3 and 4 are rolling out over 2024, 2025. But I will not get into those at the minute. I'm happy. I have slides which can be circulated afterwards that can touch on them if anyone's interested. That's currently where we are in Northern Ireland at the minute.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and Rhiannon and Jenny too. That was really interesting, and I hope useful for our attendees in getting an update on what's going on in those 3 places. Aware from the poll that a lot of our attendees are based in and working in England, so I would be absolutely fascinated to see in the chat what those of you in England, but also from the other nations, what struck you from those presentations in terms of what legal provisions that are in place or coming downstream are you really jealous of? Or are there any that you think sound good on paper but would actually come with unintended consequences or a risk in your jurisdiction? It would be really nice to hear from you in the chat on that kind of thing. We've obviously heard a lot about the positive legal changes that have happened or are in train across Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. And I wondered if the panelists could offer some thoughts on how people working on the front line have fed into and contributed to those positive changes, and also more practically for our attendees, how they might add their voice and add weight to positive legal change in the future. Did any of the 3 of you want to pick that up first? Maybe Rhiannon?
Yeah, really happy to. So actually, there's quite a specific example of how workers on the front line have fed into policy development, particularly around prevention. Recently, Crisis and Cyrenians have kind of co-chaired a group which is looking at implementation of these proposed new prevention duties. And we actually partnered with the Frontline network to host 4 different workshops where we sought your input really in terms of like what this would look like in practice and how it would benefit the kinds of work that you do, and all of that fed into the final homelessness prevention task and finish group report, which is due to be published very, very soon. It's just gone to the housing minister in Scotland. So yeah, I think it's actually impossible for policymakers to come up with effective policy without listening to people on the front line. And often, I'll be honest, from my position as a policy officer, there's huge kind of blind spots in terms of your awareness of how things are actually playing out on the ground. And I work really closely with client services staff in Edinburgh to kind of get that kind of feedback loop. For example, around local connection and how that's playing out, the recent changes in local connection. We have a meeting just next week to get feedback from client services staff on, what's missing in terms of guidance, what do we need to know in terms of how that works in practice. So yeah, I think it's just absolutely crucial to get your feedback.
Great, thank you, Rhiannon. Stephen or Jenny, did you want to chip in on this one?
Yeah, I'm happy to chip in. I couldn't agree more with Rhiannon. It is so important, and I think particularly from thinking about it from my perspective as being with Shelter Cymru for the last 12 years and working alongside lots of frontline workers in advice and support. It has been absolutely essential to me being able to do my job over these last 12 years is to be listening, not only listening, but creating space for those conversations, because I think it does need to be there needs to be positive discrimination in favour of frontline workers, if you like, because people are so busy. And because I think, frontline workers often feel not hugely empowered, that like who'd listen to me feelings, I get that quite a lot from people. And I'm always saying, look, this is really important because you're the ones who are actually seeing how this works on the day to day. And there's so many, when we talk about things like systems change, what systems need changing? What are the local policy failures, for example, around a local allocations policy that's not working, or a particular social landlord? There's local stuff, but there's also the national stuff about how legislation is actually being implemented in practice as well. So I feel really strongly about this point that it needs to be something that government not only makes space for, but actually actively makes happen. So in Wales, Cymorth Cymru, the housing support umbrella body, is a very crucial part of making that conversation happen. So they run a frontline network, regional networks, and there's a national conversation as well that Cymorth lead on, pulling all of that together. But I think it really does come down to individual organisations that have a frontline dimension as well to make sure those internal conversations are happening, because otherwise, as Rhiannon says, that the policy ivory tower can float off and think something sounds really good. And we've seen evidence of that with the Housing Wales Act. Certain things which seemed like a really good idea, like personal housing plans, for example, have turned into an absolute tick box exercise. So it's something which we need to work harder at getting right, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of this looms very large in that first session of the day before this one, hearing about the workforce challenges, that imperative to sort of create space feels really important. So Stephen, I'm going to move on to the next question and come to you first. We've heard in the chat and in the Q&A, which speaks to that last point about the importance of creating space for frontline worker voices, about some of the sort of acute urgent challenges that people are facing in their work with clients. So we've had an anonymous attendee talk about a client being found not to be in priority need when, in their view, perhaps they should be, and asking for any advice on appeal, on appealing that. We've had comments and questions about frontline workers being able to fully and comprehensively understand their obligations to clients as landlords, for example. We've had a very specific question about whether a family member or a friend can be a landlord to someone and what the regulatory requirements are there. So I suppose pulling to a more general point, and I'll come to you first, Stephen, what are some of the resources or advice or tips that you can give some people in our audience about both where to get that information, but also how to sort of effectively engage with and use legal resources, you know, to their best effect?
So in terms of Northern Ireland, specifically, there's a group of organisations called CHAP organisations, and basically they are there to provide advice to across a whole range of issues, whether it be debt advice, whether it be advice about welfare benefits, but in terms of housing as well. And these are operating out of local community centres and places like that. So like places that are like the hub of their community. So they are able to offer generalist advice in terms of like a first point of contact if you're having any sort of issues around housing. If you feel like you need to present it as homelessness and need advice in terms of like what your next steps are. So those organizations are a massive help, and they're able to refer people on to more specialist advice, whether that be housing rights in terms of advice around housing, or other bodies who may be more specialists in terms of like debt, or in terms of benefits and that kind of thing. Just in terms of how you seek to influence on a policy level, I want to echo what was said there previously. At the minute, we really have no sort of recourse for private tenants, especially to challenge decisions or make their voice heard. There's no equivalent of a first tier tribunal, anything like that. So really the expectation is on people to organise themselves. But a lot of these people are frontline workers. A lot of these people, if they're private renters or maybe experiencing homelessness, your first and foremost thought is your job, and your first and foremost thought is to maybe get secure new housing. So we cannot simply expect people to be able to organise on a serious level through which to influence policy. So what we would seek to do is embed that sort of participatory listening into policy making from the get-go, and make it the sort of the go-to means of policy making. In terms of the committee, the committees here do a fantastic job in terms of scrutinising legislation. They would go out of their way to get as many groups from communities as possible, listen to as many people with lived experience as possible. But in terms of embedding that from the bottom up in Northern Ireland policy making, that is something that we're seeking to do.
Jennie, I wondered, speaking from shelter and in a context where the priority need test still exists for the time being, if you had any reflections or advice on appealing negative decisions in that area, any sort of wise reflections from your own experience of that?
Well, I mean, we're doing a lot of those kinds of reviews, and some appeals and judicial reviews as well, working all across Wales. So, and I know that this isn't going to be relevant for everybody, but for people who are working in Wales, there is a national advice line, which we're funded to run by the Welsh Government. So I think that's a really useful first port of call in terms of getting housing advice on behalf of someone else. There are lots of online resources as well. And I think all of us who've got online resources have tried our best to really beef those up in recent years, recognising what a huge amount of need there is for people to be able to access information about housing rights. So there's the Shelter legal online resources, and we've got on Shelter Cymru, we've got a really comprehensive set of online pages as well, covering all sorts of different aspects. And especially since the Renting Homes Wales Act came into force, we've rewritten about 60% of that. So there is lots of stuff out there, but I totally get that there comes a point where you need to speak to an advisor and you need to get that legal position. So I think that there is a point about going to find the expertise. If you feel that you're a little over your head in terms of the legal advice that you're being asked for, there are sources there to go and get it, you know, rather than feeling that you have to wing it. I think there's another point here about training, and I'm always kind of shocked at the low or lack of training budget that frontline services have. And I know that when you're in a commissioning environment, you have to trim where you can, but training is so important. You know, that might be a thing about agitating internally, and, you know, and talking to line managers and talking to senior managers about the need for training. But I think that's a really important part of this too. But yeah, on priority need reviews and so on, you know, go and get legal advice and do the action, you know, on behalf of the individual, because you've only got a short time frame to get that review in.
Thank you, Jenny. Rhiannon, did you want to come in on this?
Just quickly to add, I mean, I think our colleagues at Shelter and Citizens Advice and advice agencies provide incredible resources. But in addition to that, I think locally building up connections and relationships with law centres can be really valuable, and not just in terms of referrals and that kind of thing, but also training opportunities and you know, getting short kind of bite-sized presentations on a particular area of the law and building that into your kind of, I mean, in Edinburgh, our client services carve out time on every Tuesday morning to make time for training and getting that input from external agencies. So I think I would recommend that. And finally, just I think policy, those who work in policy actually play a really important role as a go-between between frontline workers and policy makers. And so sometimes I find myself asking government officials for additional guidance on a particular area. If it doesn't exist, maybe it should, and you know, areas where people would find it useful to have more clarity. Thanks.
Great. As you'll notice, I'm not picking up on the very specific legal questions being asked in the Q&A, but I'm hoping others may be able to advise, or the Frontline Network may be able to link people into resources on that. So I'm trying to sort of bring it to a broader set of questions. I also asked you earlier, which the attendees, what the kind of parts of the law that are most challenging in your role are, and had some very interesting answers there. Unsurprisingly, we've had a lot of people mention Section 21 no-fault evictions, so positive that we may be seeing change in that area in England. We've also seen people mention the right to buy, which I think is a really interesting point because it's such a legacy and such a historic one, but one that we're still feeling the negative impacts of. And another comment was made about changes in the regulation of supported accommodation, which I think are this is in England, quite widely supported because of some of the issues in that sector, but there is a concern around unintended consequences there, and that's certainly a theme that's come up in the crisis homelessness monitor that I lead, focused on England, which is going to come out very soon. So I wondered from our panelists if they could maybe give their perspective, either from their home country or elsewhere in the UK, if you want to be brave, and say, you know, which legislative factor, which element of the law, whether it's housing law, social housing regulation, private rented sector regulation, homelessness legislation itself, if you could choose one to do away with, to replace with something better, what would you pick and why? And let's start with Jenny.
Thank you. Oh, it's really hard just to pick one. and part of me has also got that thinking about, well, the housing system is a whole system, and you can't just change one thing. You've got to look at the thing as a whole, haven't you? But I mean, we've talked about lots of different pieces of legislation. It's something which we're really keen on at Shelter Cymru, and we're working with a couple of campaigning partners on, is around the human rights to adequate housing. And I know that there's some really interesting work happening in Scotland, and you know, and you're way ahead of us in terms of an actual bill being laid, I believe, or nearly laid or something, but you're definitely ahead. We've got a green paper which is out at the moment, but yeah, we've been arguing for the right to adequate housing to be enshrined in Welsh law, and that being something which can drive more resources into housing, and you know, help to support an actual long-term strategy around housing, which we haven't really got in Wales at the moment, and ultimately an actionable right that people can rely on an individual basis if they don't have an adequate housing, an adequate home. But yeah, I mean that ultimate goal will be a long way off where we are currently at the moment, isn't it? But it would be the kind of game-changing legislation that we would really like to see. I was going to do no-fault evictions, and that's a kind of obvious one. We really want to end those as well, but I'm going to pitch for the right to adequate housing.
Nice, yeah, and it's interesting to see such movement on no-fault eviction. So one might optimistically say these things are in train. Fingers crossed. Stephen, will I come to you on your first choice, noting Jennie's excellent comments about it being a system?
Yeah, sure. I think this might be entirely everyone picking their favorite piece of legislation from Scotland and applying it to their own country. My biggest frustration at the minute in Northern Ireland is lack of regulation around the private sector, the private rental sector, and lack of protection for tenants. So I am going to have to pick the easy option and go for no fault evictions. I would like to see that enshrined legislation here and accompanied as well by something similar to the first tier tribunal, where the exceptions would apply as a reason for that a landlord could evict a tenant with a reasonable notice period, rather than what it looks like exceptions are going to come into effect here as a reason for an even shorter notice period. So yeah, it will 100% be no fault evictions, and the protection added by the first tier tribunal.
Great, thank you. Rhiannon.
My mind is going off in all kinds of different directions on this question, but I think first of all, thinking about eligibility for assistance, I think one of the things that we hear all the time from frontline services is around no recourse to public funds, and how actually, often, when you look at the population experiencing at risk of homelessness, that actually people subject to no recourse to public funds make up quite a substantial proportion of that, and I think it's really difficult for frontline staff to navigate the complexity of immigration law, and so that would be one area I think could and should be looked at again. But then I think I was going to touch on, I think that there's what we're grappling with really probably across all nations is the kind of trade-off you face when it comes to the strength of your statutory framework in terms of eligibility for assistance. If you have really strong rights for people when they experience homelessness, then you have the danger of putting the pressure on that system and the number of households in temporary accommodation, as opposed to putting more emphasis on upstream intervention and prevention and kind of loading all of the energy there. And so I think that there's this that it's always the balance in terms of where you're putting your energy, whether it's on entitlement to homelessness assistance or whether it's on more preventative action. I think you can do both, but it's a tricky one. And just on the human rights bill question, I think just to clarify, what we have now in Scotland is a consultation on a human rights bill, which will include the incorporation of UN human rights treaties into domestic law in Scotland, including Article 11 of the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So that would include a right to adequate housing, but there's big questions about what that actually means in practice, in terms of defining what that would mean in terms of obligations on public bodies. So I think we're probably a little way off, or a long way off, in terms of actually having a human rights bill. But yeah.
Thank you all. I think it's very, very interesting on the human rights lens. I mean, that does risk actually bringing more trade-offs into the housing system rather than less. And I do think there are some risks attached. So it's very interesting to see sort of sister developments in Scotland and Wales that will let us learn more about that. I think that emphasis on trade-offs, Rhiannon, is really helpful. I mean, it often strikes me that people working on the front line are the ones that have to resolve the trade-offs that are sort of passed down by national government, by Westminster, by devolved governments, and by local authorities even, and that's quite a useful way of understanding how very challenging their roles can be. So picking up on some of the comments and the questions from our attendees, I wanted to ask about supported accommodation, and maybe in terms of a trade-off, actually, a very important sector in relation to homelessness, often a much criticised sector in terms of quality of accommodation. So what would our panelists' take be on how we ought to best strike the trade-off between regulation, improving standards, restricting use, but also making sure that the supported accommodation we do need to be offered, and offered well in the sector, can flourish and exist despite some of the challenges around it? Jennie, let's start with you.
I think the stuff that's been happening in England is really interesting and worth us all looking at. But I think we need to be looking at this through the lens of the rapid rehousing transformation. And, you know, we're still very much at the start of that in Wales. But if we kind of follow that rapid rehousing logic through, we should only be providing residential supported accommodation for people who actively choose that model. And it should be a more secure housing option. The Renting Homes Wales Act has got standard contracts built into it. It's been a really controversial aspect of the Act in Wales, it has to be said. And so I think, you know, what we need to see is more of a shift towards floating support for everyone who needs it, and getting people through the system and into their own home as quickly as possible. We are some distance from that at the moment, and I'm fully sympathetic to the points about there's a lot of people's jobs involved in this systemic transformation, and there's a lot of expertise and people with amazing values and passion in the supported housing sector that we need to keep in the supported housing sector. So this has to be managed super carefully, and there will always be a need for some residential supported accommodation for people who choose it. But, you know, with those values in mind, and with the idea of transformation, you know, I don't think anyone can deny that there's a lot of people living in supported accommodation now who don't really need to be in 24-hour supported accommodation, and the restrictions on being able to work because you're stuck benefits dependent, all of that stuff is not terribly helpful for some people. So, you know, for people who don't need supported accommodation, they should be in their own homes, supported, maybe in a community setting if that's what they prefer, but they don't necessarily need to be stuck in that environment unless they really need it. So yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? But I think for us in Wales, we're very much at the start of that journey, and I'd be really interested to learn more about how it's going in Scotland, who've been working on rapid rehousing for longer than we have. Yeah, it's tricky stuff.
Thanks, Jennie. Stephen, did you want to come in on this?
Just really to echo Jennie's thoughts, supporting people here has been something which is proved massively valuable in terms of not only taking some of the impact of the housing executive in terms of getting people rehoused, but it's shown to have massive benefits to the economy as a whole. I would just agree that it should be for people who actively elect to be in it. For what we see is a lot of people who eventually want to move out of it, and I just think that any sort of policy change would have to come hand in hand with making sure that enough social housing is being built to meet the demand alongside that.
That's a lovely segue into where I was going to go next, Stephen, but I'll give Rhiannon a chance to chip in if she wants to before I move on. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I don't think we experience the same challenges in Scotland as elsewhere, and it is still a bit of a mystery to me as to why. I think it's because it's regulated differently in that supported accommodation falls under the care inspectorate in Scotland. I think that's part of the reason why, but yeah, we don't experience the same issues as certainly in England. And I would say that Crisis's position is that supported accommodation is an important housing option for people, but there's a reason why our recent campaign was called Regulate the Rogues, because there are a lot who are benefiting from a system that isn't regulated enough, and so yeah, we have seen what we think is a really important campaign win in terms of the bill passing in England, in Westminster. So yeah, and there is actually some really interesting work going on in Scotland to look at the role that supported accommodation can play as a kind of long-term permanent housing option for some people, a very small minority of people who go through the homelessness system, but that sits kind of alongside other options which are based in the community, like with wraparound support, like Housing First. So yeah, it's our colleagues at Homeless Network Scotland who are particularly sort of leading on that, if anybody's interested to kind of know more about how that looks.
Great. Thank you all for that. There's some interesting discussion in the chat actually about this, which if you're interested, I'd encourage you to look at. And one of the points being made by Detty is around, okay, maybe fewer people than are currently in supported accommodation need to be there, but the real challenge of finding appropriate move on options for people, which leads me to, I guess, a general point, which is this session's focus has been on the law, but for the law to operate well, other things need to be in place. It can't fix homelessness on its own. So I wanted to sort of bring us to that for the last few minutes of this session. And Carl has asked a brilliant and quite provocatively framed question, which I'm going to share with the panel. It's apparent from across the nations there is a lack of social housing. Do you think it's now time for the UK government, or maybe at other government levels, to step in and kick off a wide social homes build programme? As governments, LAs, RSLs seem unable to build at the scale and pace that is required to meet demand. And I suppose I'd add just a little coda there. What else can we do to increase housing supply, affordable, suitable housing supply? Should we be talking more about acquisitions, for example? So I'd love some reflections from panelists on that. And Rhiannon, why don't we start with you?
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. I mean, Crisis has just this week launched our election campaign, and the focus is first and foremost on the role of homes in meeting the demand for affordable housing, especially for those experiencing homelessness. So yeah, it's at the forefront of our campaigning at the moment. But in Scotland, we have the Affordable Housing Supply Programme, which is very welcome, and strong commitments there. But I think everyone will recognise that the pace of that is not fast enough, and we're not seeing delivery of those homes as quickly as we need to. So yes, I think acquisition does need to play a role in that. But also just other options for bringing existing stock into use. And our position really is that we don't necessarily, not everybody who experiences homelessness necessarily needs a social rented home. Like, I think that the private rented sector can play a role if you have, PRS access schemes that are, possibly with third sector partners who are an intermediary, and making sure that, people's tenancy deposits can be paid, and those kinds of things. So I think that we need to be pragmatic as well in terms of the different kinds of housing options that can meet that demand. And yeah, doing other things that can bring existing stock into use. For example, empty homes and short-term holiday lets and that kind of thing should all be part of the picture. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been hearing a lot recently about the struggles in turning around voids that some local authorities are having, and the slowing in new build, adding to those concerns. I know in Edinburgh in particular, in Edinburgh, there's been an attempt to restrict Airbnbs, which has not gone well, which feels like a really difficult moment for a city that's already facing challenges. Stephen, did you want to come in on this point?
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said there in terms of, think outside the box thinking and being pragmatic in terms of supply. So looking at things like acquisitions. There's certain groups here, the charities and things who would buy up houses and then rent it at a reasonable rate to people who are in need. The tenants, everything's fall by the book. The deposit is protected. I think that's a positive change. The housing associations here have been really sort of they've been building houses at a fairly regular rate, despite the economic challenges that we've seen over the past couple of years. But just to put in the context, our social housing waiting list here is currently 44,000 households. 33,000 of those are in housing stress. So you can sort of do all the pragmatic thinking and outside the box thinking that you want, but at the end of the day, like doing that, you're kind of just moving the deck chairs around the deck, and at the end of the day, the fundamental problem is the housing stock at the minute in Northern Ireland anyway does not meet housing need. So there needs to be a sort of fundamental rethink. I don't know if it's from a government level in terms of how the Department of Communities here is funded, although I understand that the government are in no mood to grant Northern Ireland anymore in terms of straight funding. But until the housing stock, in terms of the amount of houses being built per year, can grow to the point where it's meeting the need, then we're still going to see this massive increase in people on the waiting list, a massive increase of people being allocated into temporary accommodation, and ultimately the need not being met for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, thank you. Jennie, I'm going to come to you as the final word for the whole session and as the only respondent to the final question I'm going to bring, just to let you all know where we're going, and also to highlight in the Q&A an interesting other point on affordable housing supply from Ed about preventing developers from land banking in the way they do, which is an interesting one. As a number of our attendees have commented on, the sort of big elephant in the room that we haven't talked about yet is the welfare system, and that an adequate welfare safety net is absolutely essential in letting adequate housing supply sort of come on stream and function, and in letting homelessness legislation itself work well. So Jennie, I'm going to come to you for some wise final words on the shape of the current UK welfare system and how it relates to some of these issues we've been talking about today. So just a small one, and you've got a couple of minutes.
Okay, no pressure, thank you. I mean, oh my goodness. I mean, there are so many issues in which restrictions on welfare benefits are causing homelessness to people who are using Shelter Cymru's services, and these are an issue to a greater or lesser extent across all of the nations, aren't there? I know bedroom tax has been dealt with by the Scottish government, and that's something that we weren't able to achieve in Wales, unfortunately. There's been, I can see that there's a theme in the chat around the local housing allowance, and this is a focal point for campaigning for a lot of us at the moment. It being frozen in 2020, and I mean certainly rents in Wales have just gone since 2020, but the LHA has stayed the same. I know that this is something which the homelessness sector is 100% fixed on as a solution. By contrast, the tenant union sector has got a lot of issues with the idea of increasing local housing allowance. They've got issues with the idea of public money pouring into private landlords' pockets. They've got issues around the potential inflationary effect it might have on rents. And I think just the principle of all of that public money going to correct a failing market. And I've got huge sympathy with that, but we are in the situation that we're in. And in the long term, yes, the best place for public funds is to build social housing, as we've all been saying. But in the short term, we need to access the private rented sector more than we can at the moment. It would have an overnight effect on temporary accommodation numbers across the UK if we can get LHA unfrozen, ideally to the 50th centile where it belongs. But in the meantime, the 30th would be a great improvement on where we are currently.
All right, thank you, Jenny. Well, I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope others have too. It feels like we could have spent 3 times as long on every single question we had there, but I hope people have got something from it. And I just wanted to reiterate, you can see in the chat that the Frontline Network have a training fund that you can access, and I'm aware there were some very specific legal questions in the chat that we are probably not the right set of panelists to answer, so that might be an option going forward in terms of getting that expert input. Thank you very much all for coming, and thank you very much to all of our panelists for their great contributions, and all the best, all of you, in your work over the next few weeks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.